Hello, and welcome to the UCLA Latin American Institute series on Colombia 2021. Believe it or not, this is already our third talk on Colombia this quarter. My name is Ruben Hernandez Leon, and I am the director of the UCLA Latin American Institute and a professor of sociology here at UCLA. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker for this afternoon, Lady Diosa Jimenez, who will be speaking on political violence and the approval of immigrant political rights in Colombia, 1970-1991. Lady is a graduate of the Universidad Nacional de Colombia in sociology, specialized in political sociology, both at the undergrad and master's level, and she's currently a PhD candidate at UCLA in the Department of Sociology. Lady, welcome, and thank you very much for presenting the findings of your very interesting work on the rights of Colombian immigrants and the connections to Colombia and the Colombian state. So without further ado, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ruben. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share first. Okay, so you can see. Good. Okay. So thank you, Ruben, again, and the Latin American Institute for the invitation. I'm very grateful for it. I want to thank also Brian Pitts and Aria, which are working behind stage to make sure everything runs smoothly. My talk today explores the process of approval of immigrant political rights. I am going to focus on Colombia between 1970 and 1991. But before, I would like to show a little bit about the region and why Colombia is such a puzzling case. This is, as Ruben said, part of my dissertation on the approval of immigrant rights in comparative perspective, looking at Colombia and Argentina. I think about my cases, always in comparative perspective, vis-a-vis Argentina, also Mexico, which I also happen to have another project on, approval of rights, and the Latin American region more broadly. Let me move here. Okay, but let's begin with a note on terminology. I defined immigrant political rights as a set of rights that entails first, the recognition of dual citizenship or the capacity to acquire nationality in other parts of the world while maintaining that of the place of origin. For example, since 1996, Mexican citizens outside the country no longer lose their Mexican citizenship if they become naturalized in other parts of the world like the United States. Second, voting from abroad, that is the capacity to cast a vote in national elections even when one is residing abroad, through consulate, embassies, or mobile voting polls. For example, Argentines abroad vote in consulates, and since 2019, they can also cast votes via mail anywhere in the world. And finally, the right of political representation in the national legislative branch through a member of the House and or the Senate. For example, Peruvian citizens living outside the national territory currently have 6 seats in Congress devoted to the representation of the interest of immigrant populations of Peruvians abroad. Okay, so now that we have defined what immigrant political rights are, let's look at the approval of this type of rights in the region. The table shows 19 countries in Latin America. As you can see, there are 3 different types of countries. First, on the top of the table, we have those who have approved 1 or less rights. I call these countries restrictive. Second, in the middle, you will find moderate countries who have approved at least 2 types of immigrant rights. And finally, at the bottom, we have what I define as expensive countries who have granted 3 political rights or all or full political rights for immigrants abroad. And we have Colombia, Argentina, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, and Peru in this section. Okay, why is Colombia interesting and why we study Colombia in comparative perspective? So what is interesting when we study Colombia in comparative perspective is not only the scope of rights, that's the number of rights that it has approve, which is expansive, but also the timing of approval, which is very early. A similar case would be, of course, Argentina, that like Colombia also approved expansive set of rights at the beginning of the 1990s, and with a difference of a couple of months between these two cases. Other well-known cases, like Central American cases or the Mexican case, took longer to approve this type of rights. And I will be more than happy to discuss the implications of my research in these cases in the Q&A session. So the Colombian case is useful because it will help us address two research puzzles. First, there is the issue of timing of rights approval. Why was Colombia the first country in the region to approve immigrant political rights? And here we want to understand why these reforms happen when they happened, when they did. Second, there is the issue of scope of rights that were granted. Why did Colombia approve all three political rights early on? In fact, it was the first in the region to do so. So Colombia is a strategic case of analysis because it challenges existing explanations of this phenomenon. On the one hand, some scholars have argued that the economic motivations of the state led the approval of immigrant rights. Although this argument might be useful to cases to explain cases like El Salvador, where remittances are high, it is limited to understand the majority of cases in the region, including Colombia, where remittances were unknown at the time of approval. Second, scholarship has sustained that immigrant political rights resulted from the convergence of immigrant political mobilization processes, state cooptation mechanisms, and political party competition. This hypothesis offers relevant insights to interpret countries in which immigrant organizations played a crucial role, such as Ecuador or Peru. However, it is less successful at explaining cases like Colombia, where there is no evidence of substantive political mobilization before the approval of rights. Lastly, scholars have considered the norm internalization hypothesis. They have conceived this as a process of norm diffusion and peer pressure by which pioneer states encourage other polities to approve immigrant rights. This scenario is particularly relevant to understand the recent convergence of Latin American polities around immigrant political rights. However, this approach is less useful to explain the approval of political rights in pioneer countries such as Colombia. In sum, Colombia did not have enough remittances to motivate states to grant political rights. Political parties at home did not mount substantive political campaigns to approve those rights. And the Colombian state was not following examples of any other country in the region. The puzzling question is, why did Colombia become the first and the most expansive country to approve political rights in the region? This work is based on 11 months of field work that I conducted in different parts of Colombia. The data sources range from archives, such as the General Archive of the Nation or the Information of the Truth Commissions. I also conducted 39 interviews with key actors, such as Constitutional Assembly members, politicians, state bureaucrats, and Colombian immigrants in exile. I will be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A section. Now, let's move into the argument I'm trying to present. So the argument I'm advancing focuses on the effect of political violence, both on the regime at the top of the regime crisis and the elimination of political opposition. So here we have two paths of analysis. On the one hand, I'm interested in the destabilizing effects of political violence in the configuration of the regime. This will help us understand the timing of the political reform in Colombia, particularly the context of the Constitutional Assembly in 1991. On the other hand, I'm interested in the elimination of political opposition through political violence. As I will show, the political violence in Colombia was widespread and eliminated the social basis for a significant political organization around immigrant political rights. As a result, Colombia approved an expansive set of political rights, partially because Colombians living outside of the national territory constituted a legal category of citizens that, due to the political violence at home, lacked political mobilization and organizational power. Okay, let's zoom in. So let's focus on the effect of political violence on the regime crisis. As I said, this will help us understand the timing of the approval of rights. Okay, so the political violence and the regime crisis in Colombia. So in Colombia experienced a large-scale violence between the liberals and conservatives between 1948, 1958. This is well known in the Colombian history as La Violencia, capital L, capital V, the violence, because it had a very extreme effects on the population and throughout the territory. In 1958, the liberal and conservative parties signed the National Front Pact, also known as El Frente Nacional. This pact sought to put an end to La Violencia. For 16 years, they agreed, liberals and conservatives, agreed to alternate the presidency and equally divide and distribute bureaucratic positions of the state to, quote unquote, civilize the partisan contest. Far from its goal, this 16-year pact of the elites limited political competition and prevented any social and economic reforms, further forging factions throughout the territory, distancing regional leaders from central party structures. In this sense, political violence became a growing instrument to preserve social order and eliminate political competition within the already limited framework of the National Front. This political exclusion led to the formation of rebel groups such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, the National Liberation Army, ELN, and the April 19 movement, M19. Additionally, oppositional parties such as the Patriotic Union and dissidents from the liberal parties such as the Nuevo Liberalismo also emerged. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, illegal groups such as paramilitaries and drug cartels engaged in projects of political violence that resulted in the elimination of the emergent political opposition. Paramilitary armies such as Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia or Autodefensas Campesinas de Córdoba y Urabá, ACCU, received training from state forces and drug traffickers, built an illegal economic empire, claiming territorial ownership in several regions of the country. The 1980s came with a violent confrontation between these groups. This violence targeted primarily the Nuevo Liberalismo, Unión Patriótica, or the Patriotic Union, and the movement, the M19 movement. Despite diversity of violent actors, political violence in Colombia was mainly oriented towards left-wing movements and parties with emergent and scarce political capital. In this context, the government experienced a crisis of legitimacy, intensified by first, the illegal activities of the drug cartels, second, changes in the traditional political parties, and the crisis of the Liberal Party, Partido Liberal, and along with third, the consolidation of guerrilla groups. This figure that you have right here shows the growing violence of Colombia since the late 1970s. According to estimates from the National Historical Memory Commission, around or over 14,800 persons disappeared between 1985 and 1990. In blue, you can see the number of civilians casualties, and in orange, those of members of legal or illegal military forces. One of the implications of this graph is that political violence was mainly exercised against civil society, including members of emerging political parties. As the orange line shows, violence among armed groups has or had a comparatively lower intensity that plateaued in the second half of the 1980s. As you can expect, this war against society had significant impacts for the political organization of Colombians both at home and abroad. This is also known as the Guerra Sucia, the dirty war against society. Let's look at the role of political violence in the elimination of political opposition. And this second part of my argument, the structure of political violence in Colombia, not only destabilized the regime, as I already showed, but also destroyed the social basis for alternative political organizations. As you will see, this will help us understand the scope of political rights in Colombia. I am going to, of course, in my dissertation, I explain the different aspects of this to all the groups in Colombia, the minority political positions in Colombia. In this talk, I am going to focus on the Unión Patriótica, Patriotic Union. So this is known as the political genocide against the Unión Patriótica or Patriotic Union. Is one of it is one of the examples of elimination of political opposition in Colombia. Since 1994, members of the Patriotic Union were assassinated. After decades of investigation, we know that this campaign was carried out by the paramilitaries, drug traffickers, soldiers, and public officials. As a result, and this is where I want to emphasize the effect of political violence in political opposition, 2 presidential candidates were killed from the Unión Patriótica were killed, 8 congressmen, 13 national deputies, 70 councilmen, 11 majors, and at least 4,153 members were either killed, kidnapped, or disappeared. This is well documented in the literature. So let's look at how this shows in the national statistics and against other groups. This graph that we have right here shows how political violence mainly targeted small oppositional parties. That is, either left-wing parties or dissident minorities within traditional parties. The red area shows the impact of political violence on the Patriotic Union. And the green area under shows the impact of political violence in the dissident faction of the Liberal Party. The dissident faction is known as the Nuevo Liberalismo. So this violence that we see in the green section of the graph was mainly exercised over the Nuevo Liberalismo, which, like the Patriotic Union, lost a presidential candidate, Luis Carlos Galán Sarmiento, a minister of justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, and many of the rank and file regional members. This graph shows the lethal violence, homicides, massacres, forced displacements against Unión Patriótica or Patriotic Union between 1984 and 1990. I want to show with this graph the horizontal, the widespread violence that was exercised throughout the territory, and yet the very particular limited targeted violence exercised over one of the many minority oppositional groups that I study in my dissertation. How does this translate into migration? Why is this related to migration? So in the 1970s and 1980s, Colombia was primarily a country of emigration and was known in the region for being the second highest number of out-migration, of labor migration in the continent after Mexico. Colombia's out-migration was primarily to neighboring countries in Venezuela. Scholars estimate that between 1970 and 1981, about over 500,000 Colombians emigrated to Venezuela. In this graph, I'm showing for the American audience the migration of Colombians to the United States. So Colombia had a significant level of migration to the United States, particularly after the U.S. immigration reform of 1965. And it is estimated that over 150,000 migrants migrated legally during that period. However, what is paradoxical here is that this number of migrants does not translate into political mobilization. We don't see levels of engagement as those of other migrants, such as Argentines abroad, where they consolidated groups in Europe or build newspapers such as La Repubblica in France, and so on and so forth. But I will be more than happy to go over more of this in the Q&A session. So basically, we did see a labor migration, second in the region, and yet the repertoires of political mobilization abroad were non-existent. And here, what I want to focus on or shed light on is the role of political violence in the approval of rights. We're going to focus on the legal context of peace building processes and the legal categories of approval and the reason why we have such expansive rights. To end the violence and unravel decades of political exclusion, a civil society initiative called the Seventh Ballot, or La Séptima Papeleta, called for the creation of a constitutional assembly. The initiative was approved with over 2 million votes, and by December of 1990, the country elected 70 representatives from different political trends to draft the constitution, the new constitution. I want to point at a caveat here that the seventh ballot was initially intended to be a constitutional reform after a failed reform of 1986, where drug traffickers were involved in the creation of that constitutional assembly, that constitutional reform. So a second initiative, the seventh ballot was a second initiative to reform the constitution. Once the seventh ballot was approved and the representatives were elected, then the reform became a constitutional assembly. That sealed the constitutional assembly from external impacts, including traditional politicians, but also including drug trafficking and so on and so forth. So it is important to show that the assembly, the National Assembly, was sealed from outside, as the initial intent was very low stakes for politicians at the time. So what you have here is the call, the youth movement and the call on the Séptima Papeleta. So here you have, this is the process of when the Constitutional Assembly was installed. In February of 1991, after the Séptima Papeleta, the seventh ballot, a rather heterogeneous group of politicians, including Navarro Wolf at the center of the picture of the photo you have there, a surviving member of M90 guerrillas, that's Antonio Navarro Wolf, and then Álvaro Gómez Hurtado to the right, leader of the Movimiento de Salvación Nacional, which was a dissident from the Conservative Party, and Horacio Serpa to your left from the Liberal Party, installed what we call as the Constitutional Assembly of 1991. So the demobilized M19 political party, with Antonio Navarro Wolf as the head, received the highest number of votes, with the almost 27% of casted votes in recent history. As Navarro says, the highest percentage achieved to date by an alternative force in a collegiate body. This is a quote from an interview I had with Navarro Wolf in this year. So this holds true even in 2021. But let's take a look at how the political rights of Colombians were approved. So tracing the archives of the Constitutional Assembly, I found that the political parties or groups could propose different types of rights. So this is the first time political rights for Colombians were mentioned in the Constitutional Assembly. And it says the state will defend the rights of Colombians abroad and will help the return of those who are abroad. With this, several conversations started in Commission 1 on principles and rights, and it evolved into providing not only the right path to return, even if one left under forced circumstances, but also the right of voice. I am going to cite and extend one of another Constitutional Assembly member who referred to this political rights. And he said, if we think about the centralization of power, the idea is very simple. Why can people abroad enjoy the same rights? Why are Colombians abroad? Because they are abroad, not able to participate if what we're looking for is we'll participate in the decision that affect us. So that is why it was recognized, and there is the norm in the Constitution. Inclusion, the exercise of freedom is inclusion. And here is where I want to emphasize the context of the unravel of all this political violence and exclusion. It says, where you discriminate, exclude, point out, put up barriers or whatever, that is a focus of insurgency, war, dissatisfaction, and opposition. Participation has to be open and without limits. It entails responsibilities and duties, of course, and it has sanctions, of course, but everyone can exercise it without limitation of any kind. This is an example of the rhetoric that I find in the interview of many Constitutional Assembly members in the region, or particularly in Colombia. People refer to this as a process of providing rights for people, but not particular organizations or groups, unlike other cases. I can expand on this in the Q&A, such as the Argentine case, or even in the Mexican case. But here it was more driven by principles of inclusion and recognition of war and the effects. So in July of 1991, the rights were approved, transition from not only forcing people to come or providing the paths to return for those who were forced to leave, but also to exercise their rights, even if they decide to remain outside. So let's go back to the argument. The argument I'm trying to advance here is that political violence had effect both in the regime crisis and also in the elimination of political opposition, which led to the opening of the Constitutional Assembly. And within the Constitutional Assembly, given the lack of a foreign political opposition abroad, Constitutional Assembly members were driven by the initiative to incorporate different categories of citizens, not only Colombians abroad, but other categories. And this led to the approval of immigrant rights. Okay, so I want to thank everyone. I want to thank my funding agencies for their support, the Department of Education, Fulbright Hayes, and the NSF Law and Science Doctoral Dissertation Improvement Grant. But I also want to take a minute to thank all the individuals who were part of this research. I want to thank for the generosity of their time and for sharing their stories with me. It's an honor to be here and to represent what they have shared, even when they have endured terrible experiences of violence. Many of them still remain in exile and cannot return to the country. And to them, my deepest gratitude. And I'm going to turn it back to Ruben. Thank you, Ruben.
Thank you so much, Lady, for this very interesting presentation, and also for allowing for all of us to exchange with you. I actually want to invite now our attendees to write your questions, your respective questions for Lady through the Q&A function of the Zoom. You have the message from Ari Barrera, our program representative of the Latin American Institute, there in the chat. But you can go ahead and start, posting your questions. I'm going to take a moment aside from, already thanking Lady to thank Ari Barrera, who's at the controls here, and as always, Brian Pitts, our assistant director, who are always, providing support for these events. So while we wait for the first question or questions, Lady, let me just take advantage of the fact that I'm moderating here to ask you if you could just tell us a little bit more about your larger project, because your project, as you sort of mentioned at the beginning, was there is, you do comparative work, and you compare the Colombian case with Argentina and with Mexico. Can you just tell us, briefly a little bit about the other paths that exist to granting, political rights to immigrants?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, and thank you. It helps me elaborate a little bit more. Yes, so as you said, my dissertation looks at the comparison between Argentina and Colombia, initially intended to have Mexico as a case of comparison, but because of the pandemic and the lack of time to go and complete the field work, Mexico is a separate case that I have on my research agenda. But focusing on Argentina, so I describe Colombia and Argentina as two different paths of political approval. If we look at the timing, both Colombia and Argentina approved in 1991, with just a few months apart. So what I call the legal context of approval in Colombia is the Legislative Assembly. In Argentina, I look at it as the legal path. The mechanism, the legal context and the legal mechanism for approval is the pardons of Carlos Menem in 1990. So if we compare this, the trajectories vis-a-vis Colombia vis-a-vis Argentina, we see that around the same period, that's 1970, 1980, 1990, Argentina also experienced high levels of violence. But this violence is what we call a vertical violence exercised by the junta, the military junta, with Videla, Gartiel, Viola as the heads of the junta, but exercised vertically, not only towards minorities or dissident or left-wing or guerrilla groups such as Montoneros or Ejército de la Revolución del Pueblo, but also to traditional parties such as la Unión Cívico Radical or el Partido Justicialista PJ, the justicialist. So basically, this violence that was exercised during the same time in Colombia and Argentina targeted political actors in a different way. As in the case of Colombia, Argentines left and went abroad, but they did mobilize, as I mentioned in passing in my presentation. They formed groups, they mobilized human rights, they did an extensive mobilization, created newspapers. So in the transition, in the regime crisis, in the transition to democracy and the destabilizing crisis that happened in the 1980s in Argentina, the pardons became a way of incorporating not only left-wing groups, but also those who participated and perpetrated violence in the military regime. So the pardons were the path towards the approval of rights, and that's why we saw expansive rights. The Mexican case, on the other hand, is very interesting as the political violence that was exercised, we have been finding evidence of political violence, was hidden to a certain extent based on our findings so far, was hidden, and many of people who were subject of political violence left as economic migrants. Yet they did mobilize resources, particularly in Texas and Chicago, to gain political traction and approve political rights for Mexicans abroad. Many of these Mexican citizens learned the lobby strategies in the United States and implemented them very thoroughly in what I call the technocratic path towards the approval of rights for Mexicans living abroad. And I think I'm going to leave it there in case there is any other question.
We actually have a number of questions in which I'm going to start reading to you, so you can respond. So I'm going to read the first two, and you can address them. Professor Carl Browner asks and writes, fascinating talk. Did the Truth Commission have a significant impact on these processes? And I'm going to also read Serena Siddick's question. How were you able to schedule these interviews with the council members and others you spoke to? Was it in person? Thank you for your presentation. Why don't you take the first two questions?
Thank you so much, Professor Browner, for the question. In fact, part of what I'm trying to do with this is bring back to life those stories and the history that has been hidden. For many years, I would say for the last 2 decades, this has been a story of redemption of the liberal and conservative parties in Latin America. And yet, we know very little about the impact and the transformative effect of the left and the opposition in the region. I am doing the first chapter of my dissertation looks at the region and the 19 countries. That's where the map comes from. And I'm trying to test and advance the argument of political violence and opposition in the region, which holds true in different levels. Sometimes it works towards the approval. Sometimes it has worked in the prevention of approval, as in the Uruguayan case, as in the Salvadorian case, as in the Guatemalan case. Okay, so why am I bringing this up and why am I connecting this to the Truth Commission? Because only until recently in Colombia, the Truth Commission has gained substantive ground to present and advocate for the contribution of the history of the country, particularly Colombia, in the construction of broader, greater, better citizenships and the impact of the Colombian case, for example, in Ecuador, Peru, and even in the region. So the Truth Commission is having an impact right now. It's not that the Truth Commission happened or started in the 1990s. It's only until the second half, after the peace agreements, after the government of Santos, President Santos, that we are seeing all of these new stories coming to light. And I'm going to connect that of the Truth Commission with Serena's question. So some of the interviews I did in person. I went to Colombia, and for like 10 months, I tracked down people. I interviewed them, council members, but also the Constituent Assembly members. I interviewed face-to-face. Navarro Wolf, I interviewed via Zoom. But I have to say that this is a very, methodologically speaking, is a very interesting finding. Public figures are more willing to speak, and they spoke about their experiences, even when they were subjects themselves of political violence. Some of them have lost, limbs, have lost, speech, things like that, and they were more forward at it. With the pandemic, I started to see an increase emergence of those who are in exile, who were afraid of coming forward and giving me their experiences face to face. So I did a mix of both in Zoom meetings, but in person. I interviewed former presidents, bureaucrats, people who have played great roles in this. But of course, I'll triangulated this information with the archives. So I went to the archives first, found out who was central in the conversation, at least in the documents that I showed you, and then interviewed them. Yes, and I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you. Juan Delgado asks, what happened after 1991 once immigrant political rights were approved in Colombia? Can you tell us a bit more about the implementation of these rights?
Okay, that is very interesting. And I am, of course, my research agenda will expand on this. We'll continue exploring this. I did a fair amount of data collection and analysis on this part, on the regulation and implementation. And here the comparison with Argentina remains a fruitful one. So because the Constitutional Assembly of 1991 approved political rights for Colombians in a very broad, comprehensive manner, the regulation fell behind and experienced a lot of obstacles. You will see in future writings that I will do, of course, because I have to share this story, that the regulation of those rights did not happen until 2002. Unlike Argentina, where the rights were immediately regulated. So the 24007 law, which approved political rights for Argentines, was immediately followed by the regulatory law and implemented in the elections of 1993. It was immediately implemented because they were very set, bounded. They were meant to incorporate people who were in exile, people who were leaders of montoneros, et cetera, and everything was set in stone and bounded. In the case of Colombia, the conversation of how to regulate these laws went all the way to the Supreme Court, was denied, and came back. It was only after several iterations of trying to regulate it was approved. And when it was approved, it was so weak that Colombians abroad did not participate as extensively as those within the territory to elect the representative for those outside. So the implementation has been expanding, contracting in the Colombian case, while in the Argentine case has remained the same and has been impossible to expand. So yes, the regulation and implementation has been faulty in the Colombian case and has been very straightforward and bounded in the Argentine case. And it has been expanding in the Mexican case.
Thank you, Lady. I'm going to skip Cesar Bowley Castillo's question for a moment only, and connect your answer to the question posed by Professor Jorge Marturano, who's, by the way, the chair of our program on Caribbean Studies at the Latin American Institute. And he writes a wonderful presentation by the guest speaker. It is quite interesting, the different legal background between Colombia and Argentina, and in the case of Argentina, the continuing political push between different political positions under the presidencies of Alfonsín, Menem, and Kirchner. On the other hand, I want to ask, here comes the question, how do you compare the two countries in relation to human rights organizations who made possible this change about the legal background in Argentina and the different scope they reached in both countries?
Thank you so much, Professor Maturano. It's very interesting. In fact, the mobilization of Argentines abroad, even since the 1970s, moved around the idea of human rights. So the consolidation of the Argentine exile, one of the most known, well-studied phenomena or exiles of Latin America, moved around human rights. Not only they mobilized this political framing, but they also built all these different initiatives around human rights. To this point, when I started my field work in Argentina, I was amazed by how everything, one, was related to dictatorship, and two, was related to the impact of dictatorship in human rights. Even the expansion of third and fourth generation rights for LGBT populations, the reduction of voting age. So in the different administrations, the transitions and the legal transitions, the legal authorities, this is interesting because unlike Colombia and Mexico, where the electoral authorities are independent bodies, el INE, Instituto Nacional Electoral, or la Registraduría Nacional del Estado Civil in Colombia are independent bodies. In Argentina, electoral rights are part of the judicial system and are all tracked to the judicial system. And I find that setting interesting because it was the response to first the dictatorship, but also the response to this framing of the how do we navigate human rights to this point. Even the Kirchner's administration, with the expansion of the creation of the Provincia 25, which was an initiative in the mid 2000s, draw on the idea of human rights and human rights organizations abroad.
Thank you, Lady. We have another question by Cesar Bauli Castillo. Felicitaciones, Lady. Can you say more about the specific mechanisms through which the regime crisis, the legal framework of the peace processes, and the violence against political opposition produce the approval of immigrant rights? Are there alternative explanations you discounted? Under what counterfactuals would this outcome not happen, according to your argument?
Great, thank you so much, Cesar. Fascinating, it helps me explain my argument, of course. So let's break it down into pieces. So the first one is the legal framework of the peace process and the violence against political opposition. So what I'm trying to show here, and of course I used one example, but I also in my dissertation expand on the neoliberalismo and in the effect on M19 movement, Movimiento 19 de Abril. What happens is that there is an emerging political opposition. When we look at the national electoral votes in the different regions of Colombia, we observe, I didn't bring those stats here to the presentation, but what we see is that both the neoliberalismo, la Unión Patriótica, and the and some parts of M19 were gaining traction in the regions. So the political parties in charge lost ground. We're losing ground to all of these oppositions. So what happens is that political violence, which happened to be very, of course, horizontal because it happened throughout society. Many people were in civil society, were in between, you know, these events, massacres, this assassination, so on and so forth. But we have, unlike, for example, Argentina, Colombia has something that is called isolated targeted assassinations. Basically, so we have assassinations of people, of political leaders, but we have assassinations of people who were particularly leaders of one or two movements. So what happened is, as we all know, the documented in Guerra Sucia, war, dirty war against society, undermined those bases that were emerging in the 1980s. 1986 was a particularly good electoral year for Unión Patriótica and for neoliberalismo, for being a dissident of the Liberal Party. So basically, this violence weakened the emerging opposition, because the opposition was gaining traction, was already having a conversation vis-a-vis the leaders of the liberal and the conservative parties, demanding a reform and so on and so forth. So that opposition was killed through very targeted political violence. Now, alternative explanations. I have thought about this. The reason why I arrived to this is because the explanations thus far have claimed that the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party join efforts to approve. And yet, these initiatives were never discussed in early legislative exercises or acts. So I am discounting the political party, as the Conservative and the Liberal Party were not substantially represented in the Constitutional Assembly of 1991. When you look at the composition of the 70 representatives, mainly N19, But then minorities. One of the things that the Constitutional Assembly members brought to my attention is the fact that no one of the political parties could push for a reform by themselves, because there was no majority in the composition in the M19 in the Constitutional Assembly besides the M19, and yet they didn't have the majority to push for a reform. So it was a consensus. So counterfactuals. Under what counterfactuals would this outcome not happen according to your argument? Fascinating. I think that if the traditional politicians and traditional political parties had anticipated the impact of the Constitutional Assembly, which was initially a very low stakes call for participation, it had a lot of restrictions. I write about this in my dissertation. Basically, politicians couldn't run for office in the following elections, had very low budget. So traditional politicians had no interest in this Constitutional Assembly. Had they anticipated the impact that this had in the country, they would have participated, and of course, they would have undermined these rights. This is something that the politicians have said to me. I mean, the Constitutional Assembly members have said to me, and that is that even though the traditional politicians and the drug cartels and all of these people surrounding the Constitutional Assembly tried to infiltrate the Constitutional Assembly because of the way it was set up in this triad presidency and this consensus-like arrangement. No one, just one particular vision could be pushed or rule over others. So I have tried different, and I think that would have been one counterfactual as to why it would have not happened.
We don't have any more questions, lady, but I have one more to ask you, and I think that it connects with Cesar's questions, which is, if we think more broadly about the other cases that you have been following, but there are many other cases internationally, right, where immigrants have been granted rights. What should we conclude more generally from your study? That there are very sort of specific paths based on national experiences. Is there a role for diffusion? Because I know that this is something that is discussed in the literature. To what extent states copy each other and feel pressured internationally, regionally particularly, to follow the leaders, so to speak, right? In terms of granting access and democratizing their political systems by giving access to those who reside abroad.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. All right, let me write down here quickly so I won't forget. What is important about this argument that I'm trying to advance? I think the field has not thought about yet about the impact of political violence in the region. This might be true for other parts, and I think Danamos is expanding also this in other parts of the world, but we have not thought about how political violence and the silencing of dissidents has impacted rights in the region. Why is it important? As I said in the first chapter of my dissertation, I look at how this it lays out or maps out in the region. And the more I learn about, for example, Central American cases, the more I think this holds true. Now, violence has a different effect. I think the argument that I'm trying to advance here is the impact of violence in the approval or lack of approval or moderate approval. Let's take, for example, El Salvador. El Salvador, even though it recognizes dual citizenship and it recognizes voting from abroad. It was only until recently that it was approved. And many of the conversations, based on the research that I've done, many of the conversations that have happened for the approval of rights considered exiles as a negative variable in the approval. These people are dissidents. These people will come and change or shift our, our political regime, and so on and so forth. So even in some cases, the political violence, what it has done to the approval of rights is, in many cases, is restrain the approval of rights. Let's think about Uruguay. Uruguay is a fascinating case. Such democratic, forward-looking country, and Uruguay has consistently, even recently, denied all the rights to Uruguayans living abroad, along the lines of Cuba, along the lines of Paraguay. Even more recently, Paraguay has moved into the voting rights. But we need to understand that violence has a different effect depending on the context. And I think there is a whole world that opens up when we look at political violence, and connecting it back to what Cesar was bringing up, and that's the fact of the counterfactuals. So the counterfactuals in the region is Cuba, of course, and then we have Uruguay, and then we ask why. And then when you look at the trajectory of the politicians and also the leaders of Uruguay who live abroad, and you see, oh, okay, this makes sense. I have studied and I have followed this case closely. Even referendums to approve these rights have happened in Uruguay, and consistently people in the territory says, no, we don't want to approve these rights for them. The question is why? How did it happen? What is the impact of this, political violence that happened, in the 80s and the 70s, led to the persistent restriction of rights? And then this leads to the second part of your question, which is the question of diffusion. So I have thought about this, the norm diffusion argument. And I think it holds true for some cases. For example, when I was rebuilding the Ecuadorian and Peruvian cases, I found data suggesting that the Colombian case was taken into account. For example, the Comisión de Expertos, the expert commission in Mexico, they have 11 books on different experiences, and back in 1998, experiences of dual citizenship, experiences of voting, and the Israeli diaspora, and so on and so forth. And it helps in some cases, and yet the diffusion happens, I would say, at the last stage of approval, where we see convergence. This is also true, for example, for Bolivia. So the Bolivian case was, of course, supported by the fact that, hey, we are, the entire region is approving rights, and we haven't done that. And they draw on cases like Colombia, like Ecuador, Peru. But even in those very expensive, Ecuador and Peru, which happened after Colombia, they took Colombia as a case. So I think there is a diffusion, but I don't think this is primarily a story of diffusion, because there are many other things that are taken into account. And one of the things I find interesting is remittances are not as important as I initially thought. We start with cases where remittances are important. And when you look at Mexico, for example, you wonder, why isn't Mexico expensive, given that the remittances are so important? And that's when I see the modulating effect of the different arguments: remittances, number of immigrants, diffusion, and now violence, and state and political competition.
Thank you so much, lady, for this wonderful presentation.